Lowlands. At 5:30 in the afternoon, Dennis Flange was still entertaining the garbage man. The garbage man's name was Rocco Squarcione, and around 9 that morning, directly after finishing his route, he'd arrived at the Flange residence with an orange peel still clinging to his dungaree shirt, and a gallon of homemade muscatel dangling from a large fist speckled with coffee grounds. "Hey, Schwasim," he bellowed from the living room. "I got wine. Come on down." "Fine," Flange yelled back, deciding not to go to work after all. He called up Wasp and Winsome, attorneys at law, and got somebody's secretary. "Flange," he said. "No." She began to object. "Later," he said, hung up and sat with Rocco for the rest of the day, drinking muscatel and listening to a $1,000 stereo outfit that Cindy had made him buy, but which he had never used, to Flange's recollection, for anything but a place to put hors d'oeuvre dishes or cocktail trays. Cindy was Mrs. Flange, and needless to say, she did not dig this muscatel business. She did not dig Rocco Squarcione either, or as a matter of fact, any of her husband's friends. "You keep that weird crew down in the rumpus room," she would yell, brandishing a cocktail shaker. "You are a damned ASPCA is what you are. I doubt if even they would take some of the animals you bring home." What Flange should have answered, but didn't, was something like, "Rocco Squarcione is not an animal. He is a garbage man with a fondness, among other things, for Vivaldi." It was Vivaldi they were listening to now, Sixth Concerto for Violin, subtitled Il Piacere, while Cindy stomped around upstairs. Flange got the impression she was throwing things. He wondered every once in a while what life would be like without a second story, and how it was people managed to get along in ranch-style or split-level houses without running amok once a year or so. The Flange abode perched on a cliff overlooking the Sound. It had been built vaguely to resemble an English cottage back in the 20s by an Episcopal minister who ran bootleg stuff in from Canada on the side. It seemed everyone living on the north shore of Long Island at the time was engaged in some kind of smuggling, because there are all kinds of little spits and bays, necks and inlets which the feds still have no idea exist. The minister must have taken a romantic attitude toward the whole business. The house rose in a big mossy tumulus out of the earth, its color that of one of the shaggier prehistoric beasts. Inside were priest holes and concealed passageways and oddly angled rooms, and in the cellar, leading from the rumpus room, innumerable tunnels which writhed away radically like the tentacles of a spastic octopus, into dead ends, storm drains, abandoned sewers, and occasionally a secret wine cellar. Dennis and Cindy Flange had lived in this curious, moss-thatched, almost organic mound for the 7 years of their marriage, and in this time, Flange at least had come to feel attached to the place by an umbilical cord woven of lichen and sedge, furze and gorse. He called it his womb with a view, and in their now infrequent moments of tenderness, he would sing Cindy the Noël Coward song, half as an attempt to recall the first few months they were together, half as a love song for the house. However, Noël Coward songs often bear little relevance to reality. If Flange hadn't known this before, he soon found it out. And if after 7 years it turned out he was less a bird upon a tree than a mole within a burrow, it was Cindy more than the house who was responsible. His analyst, a crazed and boozy wetback named Geronimo Diaz, had, of course, a great deal to say about this. For 50 minutes every week, Flange would be screamed at over martinis about his mum. The fact that the money spent on these sessions could have bought every automobile, pedigreed dog, and woman on the stretch of Park Avenue visible from the doctor's office window disturbed Flange less than the dim suspicion he was somehow being cheated. It may have been that he considered himself a legitimate child of his generation, and Freud, having been mother's milk for that generation, he felt he was learning nothing new. But he would occasionally be caught, nights when snow drove down out of Connecticut, across the Sound, to lash at the bedroom window and remind him that he was lying in the fetal position after all. He would be caught red-handed at molemanship, which is less a behavior pattern than a state of mind in which one does not hear the snow at all, and the snorings of one's wife are as the drool and trickle of amniotic fluid somewhere outside the blankets, and even the secret cadences of one's pulse become mere echoes of the house's heartbeat. Geronimo Diaz was clearly insane, but it was a wonderful, random sort of madness which conformed to no known model or pattern, an irresponsible plasma of delusion he floated in, utterly convinced, for example, that he was Paganini and had sold his soul to the devil. He kept a priceless Stradivarius in his desk, and to prove to Flange that this hallucination was fact, he would saw away on the strings, producing horribly raucous noises, throw down the bow finally and say, "You see, ever since I made that deal, I haven't been able to play a note," and spent whole sessions reading aloud to himself out of random number tables or the Ebbinghaus nonsense syllable lists, ignoring everything that Flange would be trying to tell him. Those sessions were impossible. Counterpointed against confessions of clumsy adolescent sex play would come this incessant zap, mog, fud, naff, vob, and every once in a while the clink and gurgle of the martini shaker. But Flange went back again. He kept going back, realizing perhaps that if he were subjected for the rest of his life to nothing but the relentless rationality of that womb and that wife, he would never make it, and that Geronimo's lunacy was about all he had to keep him going. And the martinis were free. Besides his analyst, Flange had only one other consolation: the sea, or Long Island Sound, which at times was close enough to the brawling grey image he remembered. He had read or heard somewhere in his pre-adolescence that the sea was a woman, and the metaphor had enslaved him and largely determined what he became from that moment. It had meant, for one thing, communications officer for 3 years on a destroyer which did nothing for the duration but run hourglass-shaped barrier patrols, day and night, and for everybody but Flange too long, off the Korean coast. It had meant, when he finally got out and dragged Cindy from her mother's flat in Jackson Heights to find a home near the sea, this large half-earthen mass at the top of a cliff. Geronimo had pointed out, rather pedantically, that since all life had started from protozoa who lived in the sea, and since, as life forms had grown more complicated, seawater had begun to serve the function of blood, until eventually corpuscles and a lot of other junk were added to produce the red stuff we know today. Since this was true, the sea was quite literally in our blood, and, more important, the sea, rather than, as is popularly held, the earth, is the true mother image for us all. At this point, Flange had attempted to brain his psychiatrist with the Stradivarius. "But you said yourself the sea was a woman," protested Geronimo, leaping up on the desk. "Chinga tu madre," roared Flange, enraged. "Aha," Geronimo beamed. "You see." So that whether it crashed, moaned, or merely slopped around down there 100 feet below his bedroom window, the sea was with Flange in his hours of need, which were getting to be more and more frequent. A repetition in miniature of that Pacific whose unimaginable heavings kept his memory at a constant 30-degree list. If the goddess Fortune controls everything this side of the moon, then there must be, he felt, a curious and tender dominion or swing about the Pacific, which some say is the chasm the moon left when it tore loose from the earth. A peculiar double of his was sole inhabitant in this tilt of memory, Fortune's elf child and disinherited darling, young and randy, and more a jolly Jack Tar than any one human could conceivably be. Thews and chin taut against a 60-knot gale, with a well broken-in briar clenched in the bright, defiant teeth. Standing OOD on the bridge through the midwatch, with only a dozing quartermaster and a faithful helmsman, and a sewer-mouthed radar crew, and a red dog game in the sonar shack, along with the ripped-off exile moon and its track on the ocean for company. Although what the moon would be doing out during a 60-knot gale was open to question. But that was the way he remembered it. There he had been, Dennis Flange in his prime, without the current signs of incipient middle age, and, most important, as far away from Jackson Heights as anybody can get, though he wrote to Cindy every other night. This was when the marriage, too, had been in its prime, but now it was getting a slight beer belly, and its hair was beginning to fall out. And Flange was still wondering vaguely why this ever should have happened, even as Vivaldi discoursed on pleasure and Rocco Squarcioni gargled his muscatel. The doorbell rang in the middle of the second movement, and Cindy came suddenly roaring downstairs like a small blonde terrier to answer it, managing to scowl at Flange and Rocco before she opened the door. Standing there when she opened it was what looked like an ape in a naval uniform, squat and leering. She stared level at him, aghast. "No," she wailed. "You ugly bastard." "Who is it?" Flange said. "It's Pig Bodine is who it is," Cindy said, appalled. "After 7 years, your big gaping idiot buddy, Pig Bodine." "Hi, babe," Pig Bodine said. "Oh, good buddy," Flange yelled, leaping up. "Come in and drink some wine. Rocco, it's Pig Bodine. I told you about Pig." "Oh, no," Cindy said, barring the door. Flange, afflicted by marriage, had personal warning signals like those afflicted by epilepsy. He sensed one now. "No," his wife growled. "Out! Go! Get out! You! Move!" "Me," Flange said. "You," Cindy said. "You, Rocco, and Pig, the 3 musketeers. Get out." "What?" Flange said. They had been through this before. It ended up the same way every time. Out in the yard was this abandoned police booth which the Nassau County cops had used once upon a time to check on speeders out on Route 25A. It had so captivated Cindy that she had finally had it carted home and planted ivy around it, and hung Mondrians inside, and this was where Flange slept whenever they had a fight. The funny thing was it made little difference to his sense of snugness. The booth was womb-like as could be, and Mondrian and Cindy, he suspected, were brother and sister under the skin, both austere and logical. "All right," he said. "I'll take a blanket and go out and sleep in the booth, hey?" "No," Cindy said. "Out is what I said, and out is where you are going. Of my life is what I mean. Booze all day with the garbage man is pretty bad, but Pig Bodine is enough, and enough is too much." "Geez, babe," Pig put in. "I figured you'd forgotten about all that. Look at your husband. He's glad to see me." Pig had hit the Manhasset station sometime between 5 and 6, in the middle of the commuter rush. He was swept out of the train, propelled by briefcases and folded copies of the Times, and up to the parking lot where he stole a 51 MG and set out to find Flange, who had been his division officer during the Korean conflict. He was 9 days AWOL from the minesweeper Immaculate, docked in Norfolk, and wanted to see how his old buddy was making out. The last time Cindy had seen him was in Norfolk on the night of her wedding. Just before his ship had been reassigned to the 7th Fleet, Flange had managed to swing 30 days leave, which he and Cindy were going to use for a honeymoon. Only Pig, upset because the enlisted men had not had a chance to give Flange a bachelor party, descended with 5 or 6 friends on the reception at the NOB Officers Club, disguised as boot ensigns, and dragged Flange off to East Main Street to have a few beers. This few beers was sort of a rough estimate. 2 weeks later, Cindy received a telegram from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It was from Flange, and he was broke and horribly hungover. Cindy thought about this for 2 days and finally wired him bus fare home, with the stipulation that she never set eyes on Pig again. She had not until now. But her feeling that Pig was the most loathsome creature in the world had continued unabated for 7 years, and now she was ready to prove it. "Out that door," she said, pointing. "Over the hill and far away. Or over the cliff, I don't care. You and your wino friend and that foul ape in the sailor suit. Be gone." Flange scratched his head and blinked at her for a minute or so. No, he figured not. Maybe if they had had kids. He considered it a fine and lovely irony that the Navy had made him a competent communications officer. "Well," he said slowly, "all right, I reckon." "You can have the Volkswagen," Cindy said, "and take some shaving gear and a clean shirt." "No," Flange said, opening the door for Rocco, who had been hulking in the background with the wine bottle. "No, I'll ride with Rocco in the truck." Cindy shrugged. "And grow a beard," he added vaguely. They left the house, Pig bewildered, Rocco singing to himself, and Flange beginning to feel the first faint tendrils of nausea creeping up to surround his stomach, and piled into the truck and roared off. Flange, looking back, could see his wife standing in the doorway watching them. They pulled out of the drive and onto a narrow macadam road. "Where to?" Rocco said. "I don't know," Flange said. "Maybe I'll go into New York and find a hotel or something. You might as well drop me off at the station." "You got any place to stay, hey, Pig?" "I could have slept in the MG," Pig said. "But the fuzz probably know about it by now." "I tell you what," Rocco said. "I've got to go to the dump anyway and get rid of this load. I got this buddy there who's sort of a watchman. He lives there. He has all kinds of room. You could stay there." "Sure," Flange said. "Why not?" It suited his mood. They headed south, into that part of the island which is nothing but housing developments and shopping centers and various small light industrial factories, and after half an hour they pulled into the town dump. "It's closed," Rocco said, "but he'll open up." He turned down a dirt road running behind an incinerator with adobe walls and a tiled roof, which had been designed and built back in the 30s by some mad WPA architect, and which looked like a Mexican hacienda with smokestacks. They jolted along for about 100 yards and came to a gate. "Bolingbroke," Rocco yelled. "Let me in. I got wine." "All right, man," a voice answered out of the dusk. A minute later, a fat Negro with a pork pie hat appeared in the headlight beams, unlocked the gate, and hopped on the running board. They started down a long, spiraling road into the dump. "This here is Bolingbroke," Rocco said. "He'll put you up." They were descending in a long, wide curve. It seemed to Flange that they must be heading for the center of the spiral, the low point. "These guys need someplace to sleep," Bolingbroke said. Rocco explained the problem. Bolingbroke nodded sympathetically. "Life is a nuisance sometimes," he said. "I got 3 or 4 scattered around the country and glad to be rid of them all. Somehow you never seem to learn." The dump was roughly square, half a mile on each side, sunk 50 feet below the streets of the sprawling housing development which surrounded it. All day long, Rocco said, 2 D8 bulldozers would bury the refuse under fill, which was brought in from the North Shore, and which raised the level of that floor a tiny fraction of an inch every day. It was this peculiar quality of fatedness which struck Flange as he gazed off into the half-light while Rocco dumped the load. This thought that one day, perhaps 50 years from now, perhaps more, there would no longer be any hole. The bottom would be level with the streets of dye development, and houses would be built on it too. As if some maddeningly slow elevator were carrying you toward a known level to confer with some inevitable face on matters which had already been decided. But something else too. Here at the end of the spiral he felt haunted by yet another correspondence, and could not place it until, searching back, he came to the music and words of a song. You would hardly think, in a modern-day navy of jet planes, missiles, and nuclear submarines, that anyone still sang sea shanties or ballads, but Flange remembered a Filipino steward named Delgado who used to come up to the radio shack late at night with a guitar and sit and sing them for hours. There are many ways of telling a sea story, but perhaps because of the music and because the words had nothing to do with personal legend, Delgado's way seemed tinged with truth of a special order. Despite even the traditional ballads being lies, or at best tall tales, just as surely as the ones talked, not sung over coffee in the bosun's locker, or during payday stakes poker in the mess hall, or while sitting on a depth charge out on the fantail waiting for the evening's movie to replace one yarn with another more palatable. But the steward preferred to sing, and Flange respected that. And his favorite was a song which went, "A ship I have got in the north country, and she goes by the name of the Golden Vanity. Oh, I fear she will be taken by a Spanish Galilee, as she sails by the lowlands low."
There was a lofty ship, and she put out to sea, and the name of the ship was the Golden Vanity, as she sailed upon the low and lonesome low, as she sailed upon the lonesome sea.
It is very easy to be pedantic and say that lowlands refer to the southern and eastern parts of Scotland. The ballad was certainly of Scottish origin, but it always called up a weird irrational association for Flange. Anyone who has looked at the open sea under a special kind of illumination, or in a mood conducive to metaphor, will tell you of the curious illusion that the ocean, despite its movement, has a certain solidity. It becomes a grey or glaucous desert, a wasteland which stretches away to the horizon, and all you would have to do would be to step over the lifelines to walk away over its surface. If you carried a tent and enough provisions, you could journey from city to city that way. Geronimo regarded this as a bizarre variation on the Messiah complex, and advised Flange in a fatherly way not to try it. Ever. But for Flange, that immense clouded glass plain was a kind of lowland which almost demanded a single human figure striding across it for completeness. Any arrival at sea level was like finding a minimum and dimensionless point, a unique crossing of parallel and meridian, an assurance of perfect, passionless uniformity. Just as in the spiraling descent of Rocco's truck, he had felt that this spot at which they finally came to rest was the dead center, the single point which implied an entire low country. Whenever he was away from Cindy and could think, he would picture his life as a surface in the process of change, much as the floor of the dump was in transition. From concavity to enclosure to perhaps a flatness like the one he stood in now. What he worried about was any eventual convexity, a shrinking, it might be, of the planet itself to some palpable curvature of whatever he would be standing on, so that he would be left sticking out like a projected radius, unsheltered and reeling across the empty lunes of his tiny sphere. Rocco left them with another gallon of muscatel, which he had found under the seat, and went bouncing and snarling away into the gathering darkness. Bolingbroke unscrewed the cap and drank. They passed the bottle around, and Bolingbroke said, "Come on, we'll find mattresses." He led them up a slope, around a tall tower of bank run, past half an acre of abandoned refrigerators, bicycles, baby carriages, washing machines, sinks, toilets, bed springs, TV sets, pots and pans and stoves and air conditioners, and finally over a dune to where the mattresses were. "Biggest bed in the world," Bolingbroke said. "Take your pick." There must have been thousands of mattresses. Flange found a 3/4 width inner spring, and Pig, who would probably never get accustomed to civilian life, selected a pallet about 2 inches thick and 3 feet wide. "I wouldn't feel comfortable otherwise," Pig said. "Hurry up," Bolingbroke called softly, nervously. He had climbed to the top of the dune and was looking back in the direction they had come. "Hurry, it's almost dark." "What's wrong?" Flange said, lugging the mattress up the slope to stand next to him and peer out over the junk pile. "You have prowlers at night?" "Something like that," Bolingbroke said, uncomfortable. "Come on." They trudged back, retracing their steps, no one speaking. At the place where the truck had stopped, they angled off to the left. Above them towered the incinerator, its stacks tall and black against the last sky glow. The three entered a narrow ravine which had garbage scattered 20 feet up its sides. Flange got the feeling that this dump was like an island or enclave in the dreary country around it, a discrete kingdom with Bolingbroke, its uncontested ruler. The ravine ran on for 100 yards, steep-sided and tortuous, until at length it opened out on a small valley completely filled with cast-off rubber tires from cars, trucks, tractors, and airplanes. And in the center, on a slight eminence, stood Bolingbroke's shack, jury-rigged out of tar paper and refrigerator sides and haphazardly acquired wooden beams and pipes and shingles. "Home," Bolingbroke said. "Now we play Follow the Leader." It was like running a maze. Sometimes the stacks of tires were twice as high as Flange, threatening to topple at the slightest jar. The smell of rubber was strong in the air. "Be careful with them mattresses," Bolingbroke whispered. "Don't step out of line. I got booby traps set up." "For what?" Pig said, but Bolingbroke either had not heard or was ignoring the question. They reached the shack, and Bolingbroke unlocked the door, which was made from the side of a heavy packing case and was secured by a large padlock. Inside was absolute blackness. There were no windows. Bolingbroke lit a kerosene lamp, and in the flickering yellow light, Flange could see the walls covered with photographs clipped out of every publication, it seemed, put out since the Depression. A brightly coloured pin-up of Bridget Bardot was flanked by newspaper photos of the Duke of Windsor making his abdication speech, and the Hindenburg going up in flames. There were Ruby Keeler and Hoover and MacArthur, Jack Sharkey, Whirlaway, Lauren Bacall, and God knew how many others in a rogues gallery of faded sensation, fragile as tabloid paper, blurred as the common humanity of a 9-day wonder. Bolingbroke bolted the door. They threw down their bedding and sat, and drank wine. Outside, a small wind had risen, which rattled the flaps of tar paper and blundered, baffled and turbulent, into and around the jutting corners and irregular angles of the shack. Somehow, they started telling sea stories. Pig told about how he and a sonoman named Feeney had stolen a horse-drawn taxi in Barcelona. It turned out neither of them knew anything about horses, and they wound up driving full tilt off the end of Fleet Landing, pursued by at least a platoon of shore patrolmen. While they were floundering around in the water, it occurred to them that this would be a good time to swim out to the carrier Intrepid and stomp hell out of a few Airedales. They would have made it had it not been for the Intrepid's motor launch, which caught up with them a few hundred yards out. Feeney managed to throw the coxswain and the bowhook over the side before some wide-assed ensign with a .45 stopped all the fun by shooting Feeney through the shoulder. Flange told about how one spring weekend back in college, he and two comrades had swiped a female cadaver from the local morgue. They took it up to Flange's fraternity about 3 a.m. and deposited it next to the president of the house, who was lying passed out on his bed. Next morning, bright and early, all the brothers able to ambulate marched en masse to the president's room and began banging on the door. "Yes, just a minute," a voice groaned from inside. "I'll be right with—" Oh my God. "What's the matter, Vincent?" somebody called. "You got a broad in there?" And they all laughed good-naturedly. About 15 minutes later, Vincent, ashen and trembling, opened up, and they all trooped in noisily. They looked under the bed and moved the furniture around and opened the closet, but no corpse. Puzzled, they began pulling out dresser drawers, when suddenly there was a piercing scream from outside. They rushed to the window and looked down. A co-ed had fainted in the street. It turned out Vincent had knotted together his 3 best neckties and hung the body outside the window. Pig shook his head. "Wait a minute," he said. "I thought you were going to tell a sea story." By this time, they had killed the gallant. Bolingbroke produced a jug of homemade Chianti from under his bed. "I would have," Flange said, "only I couldn't think of any offhand." But the real reason he knew and could not say was that if you are Dennis Flange, and if the sea's tides are the same that not only wash along your veins but also billow through your fantasies, then it is all right to listen to, but not to tell stories about the sea, because you and the truth of a true lie were thrown sometime way back into a curious contiguity, and as long as you are passive, you can remain aware of the truth's extent. But the minute you become active, you are somehow, if not violating a convention outright, at least screwing up the perspective of things, much as anyone observing subatomic particles changes the works, data, and odds by the act of observing. So he had told the other instead, at random. Or apparently so. He wondered what Geronimo would say. Bolingbroke, however, had a sea story. He had spent some time bouncing around from port to port on a variety of merchantmen, all vaguely disreputable. He had spent 2 months right after the war on the beach in Caracas with a friend named Sarabes. They had jumped a freighter called the Deirdre O'Toole, sailing under Panamanian registry. Bolingbroke apologized for this detail, but he insisted it was true. Back then, you could register anything: a rowboat, a sea-going whorehouse, a battleship, anything that floated in Panama. To escape from Porcaccio, the first mate, who had delusions of grandeur. 3 days out from Port-au-Prince, Porcaccio had stormed into the captain's cabin with a very pistol and threatened to turn the captain into a human flare unless the ship were turned around and headed for Cuba. It seems there were several cases of rifles and other light armament down in the hold, all destined for a gang of banana pickers in Guatemala who had recently unionized and desired to abolish the local American sphere of influence. It was Porcaccio's intention to take over the ship and invade Cuba and claim the island for Italy, to whom it rightfully belonged, since Columbus had discovered it. For his mutiny, he had assembled 2 Chinese wipers and a deckhand subject to epileptic fits. The captain laughed and invited Porcaccio in for a drink. 2 days later, they came staggering out on deck, drunk, arms flung about each other's shoulders. Neither had had any sleep in the intervening period. The ship had run into a heavy squall. All hands were running around securing booms and shifting cargo, and in the confusion the captain somehow got washed over the side. Porcaccio thus became master of the Deirdre O'Toole. The liquor supply had run out, however, so Porcaccio decided to head for Caracas and replenish. He promised the crew a Jeroboam of champagne each the day Havana was captured. Bolingbroke and Sabares were not about to invade Cuba. As soon as the ship docked in Caracas, they went over the hill and lived off the proceeds of a barmaid, an Armenian refugee named Zenobia, sleeping with her on alternate nights for 2 months. Finally something, whether homesickness for the sea or an attack of conscience or the violent and unpredictable temper of their patroness, Bolingbroke had never quite decided, prompted them to visit the Italian consul and give themselves up. The consul was most understanding. He put them on an Italian merchantman bound for Genoa, and they shoveled coal as if into the fires of hell all the way across the Atlantic. By this time it was late, and everybody was loaded. Bolingbroke yawned. "Good night, man," he said. "I gotta be up bright and early. You hear any strange noises, don't sweat it. That's a strong bolt." "What?" Pig said. "Who's gonna get it?" Flange began to feel uneasy. "Nobody," Bolingbroke said. "Only them. They try to get in every once in a while, but they ain't yet. And there's a hunk of pipe you can use if they do." He put out the lamp and stumbled over to his bed. "Yeah," Pig said, "but who?" "Oh, the gypsies," Bolingbroke yawned. His voice was drowsing off into sleep. "They live here in the dump. Only come out at night." He fell silent and after a while began to snore. Flange shrugged. What the hell? All right, there were gypsies around. He remembered back in his childhood that they used to camp out on the deserted areas of beach along the north shore. He thought by now they had all gone. Somehow he was glad they had not. It suited some half-felt sense of fitness. It was right that there should be gypsies living in the dump, just as he had been able to believe in the tightness of Bolingbroke Sea, its ability to encompass and be the sustaining plasma or medium for horse-drawn taxis and boccaccios. Not to mention that young rogue male Flange, from whom he occasionally felt the Flange of today had suffered a sea change into something not so rare or strange. He drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, flanked by the contrapuntal snorings of Bolingbroke and Pig Bodine. How long he slept was uncertain. He awoke in that total darkness with only the visceral time sense of its being 2 or 3 in the morning, or at least a desolate hour somehow not intended for human perception, but rather belonging to cats, owls, and peepers, and whatever else make noises in the night. Outside, the wind was still blowing. He searched it for the sound he knew had awakened him. For a full minute there was nothing, then at last it came. A girl's voice, riding on the wind. "Anglo," it said. "Anglo with the gold hair. Come out. Come out by the secret path and find me." "What?" Flange said. He shook Pig. "Hey, buddy," he said. "There's a broad out there." Pig opened one unfocused eye. "Great," he mumbled. "Bring her in and let me have seconds." "No," said Flange. "What I mean is, this must be one of the gypsies Bolingbroke was talking about." Pig snored. Flange groped his way over to Bolingbroke. "Hey, man," he said. "She's out there." Bolingbroke did not respond. Flange shook harder. "She's out there," he repeated, starting to feel panicked. Bolingbroke rolled over and said something unintelligible. Flange threw up his hands. "What?" he said. "Anglo," the girl called insistently. "Come to me. Come find me or I shall go away forever. Come out, tall Anglo, with the gold hair and the shining teeth." "Hey?" Flange said, to nobody in particular. "That's me, ain't it?" Not quite, it occurred to him immediately. Closer to his doppelganger, that sea dog of the lusty, dark Pacific days. He kicked Pig. "She wants me to come out," he said. "What do I do? Hey!" Pig opened both eyes. "Sir," he said, "I recommend that you go out and obtain a sit rep, and if she's any good, like I say, bring her back in and let the enlisted man have a go at it." "Aye, aye," Flange said vaguely. He made his way to the door, slid back the bolt, and stepped outside. "Oh, Anglo," he heard the voice. "You have come. Follow me." "All right," Flange said. He began weaving his way out through the stacks of tires, praying that he wouldn't set off one of Bolingbroke's booby traps. Miraculously, he made it almost to open ground before anything went wrong. He was not exactly sure that he had misstepped, but realized suddenly that he had goofed somehow, and looked up just in time to see a huge stack of snow tires sway and lurch, hanging for a moment against the stars before they toppled over on him. And this was the last thing he remembered for a while. He awoke to cool fingers on his forehead and a coaxing voice. "Wake up, Anglo. Open your eyes. You're all right." He opened his eyes and saw her. The girl, her face, floating wide-eyed and anxious over him, and the stars caught in her hair. He was lying at the entrance to the ravine. "Come," she smiled. "Get up." "Sure," Flange said. He had a headache. He was throbbing all over. He finally managed to get to his feet, and it was only then that he had a good look at her. In the starlight, she was exquisite. She wore a dark dress. Her legs and arms were bare, slim, the neck arching and delicate. Her figure so slender it was almost a shadow. Dark hair floated around her face and down her back like a black nebula. Eyes enormous, nose retroussé, short upper lip, good teeth, nice chin. She was a dream, this girl, an angel. She was also roughly 3.5 feet tall. Flange scratched his head. "How do you do?" he said. "My name is Dennis Flange. Thank you for rescuing me." "I am Narissa," she said, gazing up at him. He had no idea what to say to her next. The conversational possibilities were suddenly limited. Though they might, it occurred to him insanely, discuss the midget problem, or something. She took his hand. "Come," she said. She pulled him after her into the ravine. "Where are we going?" Flange said. "To my home," she answered. "It will be dawn soon." Flange thought about this. "Well, wait a minute, hey," he said. "What about my buddies back there? I'm abusing Bolingbroke's hospitality." She did not answer. He shrugged. What the hell? She led him through the ravine and up the slope. On top of the pinnacle of Bank Run stood a human figure, watching them. Other shapes hovered and flitted in the darkness. From somewhere came the sound of guitar music and singing, and a fight in progress. They entered the junk pile he had passed before on the way to get a mattress, and they began picking their path through a cast-off chaos of starlit metal and porcelain. Finally, she stopped at a General Electric refrigerator which lay on its back and opened the door. "I hope you'll be able to fit," she said, climbed in, and disappeared. "Oh, Christ," Flange thought. "I've been putting on weight, haven't I?" He climbed in. The back of the refrigerator was missing. "Shut the door after you," she called from somewhere below, and he obeyed, trance-like. A beam of light shot up, probably from a flashlight she was holding, to show him the way. He had not realized that the junk pile ran to such a depth. There were some tight squeezes, but he managed to worm his way between, around, and down through various loosely stacked household appliances for about 30 feet until he reached the opening of a 48-inch concrete pipe. She was there waiting for him. "From here on, it is easier," she said. He crawled. She walked down a gentle incline which must have run for 1/4 of a mile. In the wavering beam of the flashlight, between flickering shadows, he could see that there were other tunnels which led off from this one. She noticed his curiosity. "It took them a long time," she said, and told him how the entire dump had been laced with a network of tunnels and rooms back in the 30s by a terrorist group called the Sons of the Red Apocalypse, by way of making ready for the revolution. Only the feds had rounded them all up, and a year or so later, the gypsies had moved in. They reached a dead end finally, with a small door set in the gravelly soil. She opened it, and they entered. She lit candles, whose flames revealed a room hung with arrases and paintings, an immense double bed with silk sheets, an armoire, a table, a refrigerator. Flange had all kinds of questions. She told him about the air supply, and the drainage and the plumbing and the power line that had been run in without Long Island Lighting's ever suspecting. About the truck which Bolingbroke used in the daytime and which they drove out at night to steal food and supplies. About Bolingbroke's half-superstitious fear of them and his reluctance to inform anyone in authority about all this, lest he be accused of alcoholism, or worse, and lose his job. It occurred to Flange that there had been a grey, furry rat sitting on the bed for some time, peering at them inquisitively. "Hey," he said, "there is a rat over there on the bed." "Her name is Hyacinth," Narissa said. "Before you came, she was my only friend." Hyacinth blinked non-committally. "That's nice," Flange said, reaching over to pet the rat. She squealed and backed away. "She is shy," Narissa said. "She will make friends with you. Give her time." "Huh," Flange said. "That reminds me. How long do you expect me to stay here? Why did you bring me?" "The old woman with the eye patch, who is called Violetta, read my fortune many years ago," Narissa said. "She told me a tall Anglo would be my husband, and he would have bright hair and strong arms and—" "Of course," Flange said. "Yes. But us Anglos all look like that. There are all kinds of Anglos roaming around who are tall and blonde." She pouted. Tears began. "You do not want me for your wife." "Well," Flange said, embarrassed, what it is I already have a wife. I'm married is what I mean." She looked for a moment as if she had been stabbed, then began to bawl violently. "All I said was I was married," Flange protested. "I didn't say I enjoy it particularly." "Please don't be angry with me, Dennis," she wailed. "Do not leave me. Say you will stay." Flange thought about this for a while. His silence was suddenly broken by the rat Hyacinth, who did a backward somersault on the bed and began to thrash around violently. With a sharp, pitying gasp, the girl picked up the rat, held it against her breast, and began to stroke it, croon to it. She looks like a child, Flange thought, and the rat like her own child. And then, I wonder why Cindy and I never had a child. And a child makes it all right. Let the world shrink to a bocce ball. So, of course, he knew. "Sure," he said. "All right, I'll stay. For a while, at least," he thought. She looked up gravely. Whitecaps danced across her eyes. Sea creatures, he knew, would be cruising about in the submarine green of her heart.